The Saints had spent the year of 1834 in a prolonged battle with the state of Missouri. Mormons had been threatened, attacked, and driven from their homes. After Zion's camp had arrived from Kirtland in an aborted attempt to restore the Saints to their homes, many of the members of the camp decided to settle in Missouri. One of these young men paid a visit to Bishop Edward Partridge, who presided over the Saints in that area. It was December 31st, 1834, and the young man explained that this very day was his first anniversary as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In humble gratitude, he had come to offer all his worldly possessions, however meager they may be, to the building up of the kingdom. Bishop Partridge knew right away that great things would be accomplished by this faithful young convert. His name was Wilford Woodruff. That night, Wilford followed up his offer to the bishop with an equally sincere promise to the Lord, which he recorded in his journal.
Be it known that I, Wilford Woodruff, do freely covenant with my God to consecrate and dedicate myself, together with all my properties and effects, unto the Lord. I lay all before the bishop of his church, that I may be a lawful heir of the celestial kingdom of God.
The life of Wilford Woodruff stands as evidence that he lived up to this sacred promise made to the Lord. He lived the gospel and he taught the gospel from that moment on for the rest of his life. And though he met often with trials and sufferings, he always saw through them to the greater purposes of God. Clearly, Wilford Woodruff consecrated his life to the Lord and God of modern-day Israel.
My father, Wilford Woodruff, was born in Farmington, New York in 1778. He married Beulah Thompson, who bore him 3 sons. Asmon, born 1802, Thompson, born 1804, and myself, born March 1st, 1807.
Wilford Woodruff was born into a family that, like many families in this newly established land of freedom, was struggling for survival. His father, Aphek, worked 18 hours a day in a Connecticut flour and sawmill.
My father was a man of great charity, honesty, and integrity, and made himself poor by giving to the poor.
Wilford's mother died in the winter of 1808 from spotted fever when Wilford was only 15 months old. Seeing that his young children needed a mother, Aphek soon married Azuba Hart, who would eventually bring 6 more children into the Woodruff household.
From Wilford's earliest days, he learned not only the necessity of hard work, but also of his dependence upon a supreme being. Between the ages of 5 and 15, he encountered numerous life-threatening accidents. Wilford wrote,
Evidently, I have been numbered with those who are apparently the marked victims of misfortunes. It has seemed to me at times as though some invisible power were watching my footsteps in search of an opportunity to destroy my life. I therefore ascribe my preservation on earth to the watch care of a merciful providence, whose hand has been stretched out to rescue me from death when I was in the presence of the most threatening dangers.
When one looks at Wilford Woodruff's diary and listens to his discourses about his early life, you can only come to one conclusion. This was an accident-prone kid. I mean, everything imaginable happened. He just seemed to always get in trouble, from being scalded to breaking his legs to his ankles to almost drowning. And it's the most interesting thing about all of this is the way Wilford Woodruff interpreted it. He believed someone knew what his mission would be, and therefore all of these accidents were intended to basically take his life.
Although the evil armies of darkness had clearly marked Wilford for destruction, the Lord would not let it happen. It was as if legions of heavenly hosts were entrusted with protecting Wilford and ensuring his future as a chosen prophet of God. He recorded,
I have broken both legs, one of them in 2 places. Both arms, both ankles, my breastbone, and 3 ribs. I've been scalded, frozen, and drowned. I've been in 2 water wheels while turning under a full head. I've passed through a score of other hairbreadth escapes. The repeated deliverances from all these remarkable dangers I ascribe to the mercies of my Heavenly Father.
When not recovering from injury, Wilford could most often be found in school. Young Wilford was blessed to receive schooling that was rare for many in the early 19th century. He attended common school in Farmington until he was 14. Then, from age 14 to 18, he advanced into the Farmington Academy, where he was able to study subjects such as chemistry, geometry, algebra, and philosophy, as well as languages like Latin and Greek.
Although many of his early years were spent in schooling, Wilford also learned to work hard while laboring in various mills near his hometown of Farmington. During these years, he also discovered trout fishing, which would become his favorite hobby for the next 80 years. Wilford and Thompson were known by many in the area as the best fishermen on the old farm brook.
Throughout his youth, however, Wilford also had a deep interest in spiritual matters. Fueled by the untimely death of his 16-year-old brother Philo in 1827, he felt a great need to obtain spiritual truth, and he found himself quite frustrated by his inability to do so. He recorded,
I attended the meetings, inquiry, Sunday schools, and prayer meetings. I tried to get religion by effort and prayer, but my efforts created darkness instead of light, and I was not happy in the attempt. They wanted us to give our hearts to God without telling us what to do or explaining any principle in a comprehensive manner.
One of the reasons Wilford was so particular in his search for the truth was the influence of an older man named Robert Mason. Wilford wrote,
Father Mason did not claim that he had any authority to officiate in the ordinances of the gospel, nor did he believe any such authority existed. He did, however, believe that it was the privilege of any man who had faith in God to fast and pray for the healing of the sick. He believed it his right, and the right of every honest-hearted man or woman to receive light and knowledge, visions, and revelations by the prayer of faith.
In 1830, shortly before the death of Father Mason, he told Wilford of a dream he had received nearly 30 years earlier. He spoke of being carried into an orchard and looking for fruit to eat, but not finding any. Then all of the trees were blown over by the wind, and new trees sprouted up in their place. The new trees bore fruit, but before Father Mason could eat any, the vision closed before him.
Now, in the spring of 1830, while unknown events of the Restoration were taking place in nearby New York, Father Mason unfolded this dream and its meaning to Wilford. He told him that a new church would be organized, one with authority, and that the kingdom of God would be manifest to the world. Father Mason stated,
Wilford, I shall never partake of this fruit in the flesh, but you will. And you will become a conspicuous actor in the new kingdom.
Although just in his early 20s, Wilford continued his study of the scriptures as he set about making a livelihood for himself. In the summer of 1832, he and his brother Asmon decided to join the country in its gradual move west and establish themselves in western New York.
While Wilford Woodruff was living in Connecticut, he had the impression that he should go to Rhode Island. And he didn't know the reason for it at that time, but he dismissed it. Later, he moved to New York, where he was involved in farming with his brother Asmon. And the two of them met the missionaries in December of 1833 and were converted to the church. Shortly after that, he learned that the missionaries had been in Rhode Island at that time, and he'd missed them. And he was convinced that if he'd gone to Rhode Island at the time that he felt the impression to go, that he probably would have joined the church earlier.
On December 29, 1833, While Wilford and his brother were away at work, 2 Mormon elders came by their home. They told Asmund's wife, Elizabeth, that a meeting would be held that evening, and the 2 brothers were invited. Wilford recorded his excitement at the news.
Upon my arrival home, my sister-in-law informed me of the meeting. I immediately started for the schoolhouse without waiting for supper. On my way, I prayed most sincerely that the Lord would give me his spirit, and that if these men were the servants of God, I might know it. When I reached the place of meeting, I found the house already packed. Elder Pulsifer opened with prayer. After singing, he preached for an hour and a half. The Spirit of the Lord rested upon me and bore witness that he was a servant of God.
Having spent years in his search for the true gospel, Wilford refused to wait any longer for the ordinances it had to offer. On the cold, final day of December 1833, Wilford and his brother Asmund entered the icy waters of baptism and began the promising journey toward eternal life. Wilford stated,
"The snow was about 3 feet deep. The day was cold, and the water was mixed with ice and snow. Yet I did not feel the cold."
Hundreds of miles away, the prophet Joseph Smith recorded in his journal the baptism of this young man in New York. They had never met, and Wilford was seemingly just one of hundreds of converts who were accepting the gospel. Yet the prophet Joseph seemed to sense that the baptism of Wilford Woodruff was an important event in the history of the church.
In the spring of 1834, persecution of the saints in Missouri reached such extremes that the Lord instructed Joseph Smith to organize a force of brethren in Kirtland to defend the troubled members in Jackson County. The prophet sent elders throughout the branches of the church to recruit volunteers for a march to defend Zion, a journey which became known as Zion's Camp. Parley P. Pratt arrived in the Richland, New York branch on April 1st, 1834, seeking recruits, and Wilford Woodruff, only 4 months a member, responded faithfully to the call.
On the 25th of April, Wilford arrived in Kirtland and met the prophet Joseph Smith for the first time. He remembered,
Brother Joseph shook hands with me most heartily. He invited me to make his habitation my home while I tarried in Kirtland. This invitation I most eagerly accepted and was greatly edified and blessed during my stay with him.
the first wagons of Zion's Camp to depart pulled out of Kirtland on May 1st. They traveled some distance to New Portage, where they set up camp and waited for additional brethren to join them. On his first night in this camp, Wilford climbed a nearby hill and prayed to his God, grateful to see some of the tents of Israel pitched and a company gathered by the commandment of God to go up and help redeem Zion.
Under the direction of Joseph Smith, Zion's Camp traveled hundreds of miles in 6 weeks, often with limited supplies of food and water. Some of the brethren were quick to complain, but Wilford remained ever faithful.
Wilford Woodruff joined Zion's Camp as a young convert. I think he'd been a member of the church 4 months. And he came into this with a zeal and a desire to serve the Lord. In fact, his whole life, he talked about his willingness to give his life for the Lord. And I think he learned that lesson in Zion's Camp. It was not an easy task, but Wilford Woodruff was firm in his testimony and firm in his support of the prophet Joseph. And he marched right by his side. And Joseph then received a revelation from the Lord that their efforts were accomplished without ever having taken up their arms. What was the purpose of that? Well, you look at Wilford Woodruff, and you see the purpose of that. You see it in Brigham Young. You see it in George A. Smith. You see that of the quorum of the 12 apostles, 9 of those men marched to Zion's camp. It was a training ground, a preparation. It was a way of Joseph taking these men out of the world and having a chance to work with them. It was a way for them to feel the power of the Spirit, separated from everyday life. It was a way for them to learn to follow the prophet of God. And Wilford Woodruff was prepared in that march to Missouri.
At the encouragement of the prophet, Wilford decided to stay in Missouri rather than returning to Kirtland. Lyman White offered the new convert both a place to live and a job making bricks. It was here in Missouri that Wilford would reach the first anniversary of his baptism on December 31st, 1834. And that night, he recorded in his journal the sacred promise of consecration he would make to the Lord.
Wilford's first missionary call came in a rather miraculous way. Fresh off of Zion's camp and living in Missouri, Wilford had a desire to serve a mission, and he went out into the woods and pled with the Lord to give him the chance to serve. As he prayed, he felt the Spirit of the Lord tell him that he would have the chance to serve a mission. As he came out of the grove of trees where he had been praying, he bumped into Elias Higbee, a high priest who was passing by, and he said, "Wilford, the Spirit of the Lord is manifest to me that you should serve a mission. Let's get you ordained and send you on your way." Wilford very soon was on his way to the southern states, where he served his first mission.
In January of 1835, Wilford Woodruff and his companion Henry Brown left without purse or script on a mission to the southern states of Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Their first challenge was traveling south through Jackson County, where the mobs had so violently driven the saints out not long before. At one point, after traveling 60 miles with nothing to eat, the young missionaries arrived at the home of a man named Beman, who was part of the mob in Jackson County. The man was just sitting down to eat with his family. Wilford recorded the event in his journal.
In those days, it was the custom of the Missourians to ask you to eat, even though they were hostile to you. So he asked us to take breakfast. He knew we were Mormons. And as soon as we began to eat, he began to swear about the Mormons. Though his swearing did not hinder our eating, for the harder he swore, the harder we ate. The last we heard of him, he was still swearing. I trust the Lord will reward him for our breakfast.
Eventually, the missionaries made their way across Arkansas, sometimes by foot and other times by boat, finding success in the form of several convert baptisms. Near the end of March, however, Henry Brown parted company with Wilford so he could travel to Kirtland and see his family. Alone, Wilford ferried across the Mississippi to Memphis, Tennessee. He went straight to the best inn he could find and set an appointment to preach. Noticing Wilford's filthy, worn-out appearance, the innkeeper thought his preaching would be good for a laugh, and so he spread the word around town, and quite a crowd came to hear the dirty young preacher. However, when an uninhibited Wilford opened the meeting by kneeling in prayer, the group was quickly humbled, and they listened quietly to the 90-minute sermon.
Wilford soon left Memphis for Benton, where he had the good fortune to happen upon Warren Parrish, a member of the 70 who was also currently without a mission companion. Together, they baptized 20 converts, and before leaving, Warren ordained Wilford an elder on June 28, 1835, and gave him charge over the branches in the south. Despite not having a companion for the remainder of the year, Wilford met with much success. Large congregations would gather to hear him speak, and many were baptized. He recorded his statistics for the year 1835 in his journal.
I traveled 3,248 miles, held 170 meetings, baptized 43 persons, assisted Elder Parrish to baptize 20 more, confirmed 35, organized 3 branches, ordained 2 teachers and 1 deacon, and finally closed the labors of the year 1835 by eating johnny cake butter and honey at Brother A.O. Smoot's.
On December 2nd, 1836, Elder Woodruff was honorably released from his mission. He visited briefly with the beloved members of the southern branches, many of whom he had baptized, and then made his way north to Kirtland. During his 2-year mission, Wilford had baptized dozens of converts, healed the sick, withstood the threatenings of violent mobs, and established branches throughout the region. He had also gained invaluable experience as a preacher and church leader. Wilford would often recall his mission to the South as one of the most spiritual times of his life.
Near the end of 1836, as Wilford walked into Kirtland, he spied something he had never seen before: the temple. He recorded this special moment.
I truly rejoiced when the house of the Lord rose into view as we drew near to this stake of Zion. It was the first time I had seen the temple of God, the first in this generation.
In 1836, the country fell on hard financial times, and banks everywhere were having trouble. The Bank of Kirtland was no different, and when the hard times came, many saints, even the faithful, blamed the prophet Joseph for the difficulties. Wilford, however, remained faithful to the church and to the prophet Joseph. On one occasion, when Joseph met Wilford on the street, he scrutinized him closely and commented,
"Brother Woodruff, I'm glad to see you. I hardly know when I meet those who have been my brethren in the Lord, who of them are my friends. They have become so scarce."
Wilford's loyalty to the prophet during this trying time did not go unnoticed, and on January 3rd, 1837, he was called to the first quorum of the 70.
Just a few weeks later, Wilford met a young convert by the name of Phoebe Carter. Born just 7 days after Wilford to Ezra and Sarah Carter, Phoebe grew up in Scarborough, Maine, where she worked as a tailor and a school teacher. In 1834, at the age of 27, Phoebe had been baptized and left her family to join the saints in Kirtland. After a short but joyful courtship, Wilford and Phoebe were married on April 13, 1837.
Less than 2 months into his marriage, Wilford felt strongly that he should preach the gospel in the Fox Islands off the coast of Maine. Receiving approval and blessing from the 12, Wilford then made plans for Phoebe to visit her family in New England and be closer to him as he served the Lord.
Wilford and his companions then traveled across upstate New York to Avon, where Wilford had lived for many years. Here, Wilford had the opportunity to visit and teach many of his relatives and former friends. He taught and baptized his Uncle Ozim, Aunt Hannah, and their son John. In his journal, Wilford wrote that this sacred event marked the fulfillment of a dream he had as a boy of 11 in 1818. Wilford and Elder Hale continued on to Scarborough, Maine, where they stayed with Phoebe for 8 days at the home of her father, Ezra Carter.
This was the first time that Wilford had met the Carter family, his in-laws. They were not members of the church, but a very warm relationship soon developed, and they became very close. Later, the two brothers of Phoebe took Wilford out fishing. He did like fishing. This was in the sea, and he notes in his journal 250 cod and haddock. But the most impressive thing for him on that trip was he noted again in his journal that he had seen 4 humpback whales, and then added the detail that it was the first time he had seen the kind of an animal that had swallowed up Jonah.
On August 19, 1837, Elders Woodruff and Hale finally departed for the Fox Islands, leaving Portland, Maine on the steamship Bangor. They arrived at 2:30 a.m. on North Vinyl Haven, one of the 2 Fox Islands, the second island being South Vinyl Haven. The next morning, the elders met with the local Baptist minister, Reverend Newton, and arranged for their first sermon to be taught that evening in his church. Following their preaching, Wilford noted the significance of the event.
This was the first time that I or any elder of the church, to my knowledge, ever arose before the inhabitants of one of the islands of the sea to preach unto them the fullness of the everlasting gospel and the Book of Mormon.
After just 2 weeks on the Fox Islands, Wilford and his companion John Hale would find the first fruits of their efforts, baptizing a sea captain and his wife. Before leaving Kirtland, some of the apostates had tried to discourage Elder Hale from serving a mission, claiming that he would baptize no one. So Wilford made certain that his companion baptized this couple. There were only 800 or so people on North Vinalhaven at the time, and roughly 1,000 on the South Island, so the teaching of these young Mormon elders created no small stir. Reverend Newton, who had at first befriended them and actually gained a testimony of their work, soon turned against the missionaries. And yet the elders continued to baptize. Eventually, Mr. Newton recruited Reverend Douglas, the minister from South Vinalhaven, to help fend off the Mormon elders. In response, Wilford and Elder Hale began preaching and baptizing on the South Island as well.
In October, however, Elder Hale determined that he was needed with his family back in Kirtland. Using local converts as companions, Wilford continued to teach and baptize as a lone missionary. So faithful were these new converts that during the winter months, they would clear ice from the frozen sea in order to participate in the saving ordinance.
In the spring of 1838, Wilford received a directive from Kirtland that he should return to Zion and bring his converts with him. As he began the work of organizing these new saints to travel thousands of miles, Wilford was impressed that he should visit his father in New York.
Wilford was promised in his patriarchal blessing that he received in Kirtland under the hands of Joseph Smith Sr. that he would see his family come into the church. You can imagine what a promise that was to someone who, in joining the church, left his family and did not have the opportunity to see them interested in the gospel even. So many of the early brethren faced that issue of family or the gospel, and they chose the gospel, Wilford being one of them. Well, he was then called on a mission to the Fox Islands, which were just off the coast of Maine, and this was 1837.
While serving a mission in the Fox Islands, Wilford was directed by the Spirit to go to his father and preach the gospel. He preached the gospel to his father, his stepmother, his sister, and they all joined the church. Even some of the friends and relatives in the neighborhood did, including a Methodist minister whom Wilford ordained to the priesthood and set up a small branch in his father's hometown of Farmington, Connecticut.
On July 14th, Wilford was again blessed. He arrived in Scarborough just days before his first child, Sarah Emma Woodruff, was born to his dear, sweet Phoebe as she stayed in her family home. Also on this very same day, word was sent from President Thomas B. Marsh in Kirtland that Wilford had been chosen to fill a vacancy in the Quorum of the 12. Although Wilford would not receive the letter for several weeks.
By the fall of 1838, Wilford and Phoebe were prepared to lead 53 saints on the long journey to Zion. A late start added much hardship to the already challenging trip. Snowstorms made for slow and miserable traveling. Many were sick, including Phoebe, who at one point was so ill that Wilford feared she would die. When word reached the company that the saints had been driven out of Missouri and were traveling to Commerce, Wilford settled his weary group in Rochester, Illinois. They would remain there until the spring, when they would join with the body of the saints on the banks of the Mississippi.
In 1838, Joseph Smith had received a revelation instructing the apostles to leave on their mission to England from the far west temple site. Unfortunately, when the date that was given for leaving on that mission arrived, the church was in Commerce due to the Missouri persecutions, and it was very dangerous for a Latter-day Saint leader to be in Missouri. But Brigham Young, very determined that the Lord's commandment would be fulfilled, gathered up the apostles that were there, and they made a journey back to the far west temple site. Wilford Woodruff had just arrived from his mission to the Fox Islands at that time, and he accompanied them back, once again leaving his family to fulfill the prophecy of Joseph Smith.
Wilford Woodruff is called to the apostleship, and as part of that is assigned to accompany his fellow apostles to the British Isles. The enduring image I have of that mission is the brethren are very, very ill, leaving wives and family. Wilford, in fact, will lose a child or two while he's away on his mission. Waving goodbye and simply knowing that they're leaving families in incredible poverty, as a man has no way at that point in time to care for them, trust that the church will keep an eye on them. And he himself isn't sure that he's healthy enough to get to where he's been assigned to go. And so that very powerful, almost image of pathos for me, expressing faith, expressing trust that in fact they'll eventually be reunited.
When Elder Woodruff arrived in England in January of 1840, he set out immediately to teach the gospel in and around the towns of Birmingham and Staffordshire. He recorded the success he experienced in these early days of his ministry.
I baptized, confirmed, and blessed many, and we had a good field open for labor. Many were believing, and it appeared as though we had a door open to bring into the church many in that part of the vineyard.
As prosperous as these initial efforts were, Wilford could never have imagined the bounty of converts the Lord had prepared for his young American missionary. On March 1st, his birthday, while speaking to an assembled crowd of saints and strangers, Wilford suddenly found himself impressed to announce that this would be his last meeting in the area for quite some time. Wilford was as equally shocked as the congregation because he had several appointments scheduled in the community. But being a faithful servant of the Lord, he knew he was being called and was determined to listen. The next morning, Elder Woodruff was instructed by the Lord to travel south, as many souls were waiting for the message he would bring them.
Over the next several days, Wilford traveled by coach and by foot until he reached the farming community of Hertfordshire in the south of England. There, he boarded with a wealthy farmer named John Benbow, who was overjoyed to hear the news of the restoration Wilford brought to the country. Mr. Benbow went on to tell the young missionary that he was part of a group of 600 truth seekers who had taken upon themselves the name of United Brethren. Elder Woodruff recorded,
The body of United Brethren were searching for light and truth, but had gone as far as they could, and were calling upon the Lord continually to open the way before them and send them light and knowledge, that they might know the true way to be saved. When I heard these things, I could clearly see why the Lord had commanded me to go to the south.
2 days later, after an evening sermon, Elder Woodruff baptized his first 6 converts from the United Brethren. He spent the next day clearing out a pool of water that he would use as a baptismal font. Over the next 6 months, Wilford would take all 600 members of the United Brethren, save one, into these soul-cleansing waters.
Wilford Woodruff's mission to the south of England was really a great success. But in the process, his persuasive power was really illustrated by the way he converted some people. There is an interesting story, for example, of a constable who was sent down to one of the communities where Wilford was preaching to arrest them for disturbing the peace. But Wilford Woodruff was preaching when the constable came in and asked him to wait until afterward, and then he would talk to him. And after the meeting was over, the constable who came to arrest Wilford Woodruff came up and asked for baptism instead. He was converted because of the powerful preaching of Wilford Woodruff. Not long after that, 2 clerks from the Church of England were sent to spy on the Mormons, just to see what are they doing. And at the end of that meeting, they were converted. Wilford Woodruff taught by the Spirit, and the Spirit got to the people, and that's what converted them.
Wilford recorded in his journal that during his 8 months in southern England, he was able to baptize over 1,800 people, including 200 preachers of various denominations. He stated,
The whole history of this Herefordshire mission shows the importance of listening to the still, small voice of the Spirit of God. The people were praying for light and truth, and the Lord sent me to them.
It was not long after arriving in Herefordshire that Wilford also received joyful news from home. His first son, Wilford Jr., had been born on March 22, 1840. Unfortunately, however, it was soon thereafter that he was delivered another letter from his wife that bore him unhappy news concerning his only daughter. Phoebe wrote,
My dear Wilford, what will be your feelings when I say that yesterday I was witness to the departure of our little Sarah Emma from this world? Yes, she's gone. She was too lovely, kind, and affectionate to live in this wicked world. She used to call her Papa and left a kiss for her Papa before she died. Oh, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
Despite the difficult circumstances in his personal life, Elder Woodruff remained devoted to the work to which he had been called. Trusting his family to the care of the Lord, he continued to serve and teach the people of Great Britain until the spring of 1841, when Joseph Smith called the apostles home to Nauvoo.
I think Wilford Woodruff was very much like the Apostle Paul. You see Paul teaching the Galatians, and great numbers of people come into the gospel. You see him going to the Thessalonians, and you see him writing these epistles to these people. Wilford Woodruff wrote thousands of letters during his lifetime to converts to the church that he had worked with, or to people that he hoped to convert. He had that same bent about him, and he had that same teaching the British, just like Paul taught the Galatians. You saw this Wilford Woodruff step forward and stretch the kingdom of God on earth to a new area. And you read about that in Paul. You read about that from Wilford Woodruff. He kept a great journal of his own. In fact, so much of what we know about the early church we know from Wilford Woodruff. And then you look at how much we know about the early Christian church, and we know it from Paul. So there's a great parallel there between the two of them, both of them incredible missionaries.
Upon his return to Nauvoo in October of 1841, Wilford was finally able to settle down and spend time with his loved ones. He recorded,
It is a privilege to be at home for a season and provide for my family. This is the first time since I have been in the church that I have been thus privileged, as I have been on missions most of the time for 8 years.
Wilford was soon appointed a member of the city council and given responsibility in the construction of the Nauvoo House and the Nauvoo Temple. But for Wilford, the temporal matters of day-to-day life were easily overshadowed by the spiritual blessings he enjoyed through once again being in the presence of his prophet and leader, Joseph Smith. He loved to attend the conferences in which Brother Joseph addressed the saints, and he rejoiced at every opportunity to sit in council with his fellow apostles and discuss the affairs of the kingdom.
On July 7, 1843, after enjoying 2 uninterrupted years of associations with the saints and the joyful companionship of his family, Wilford departed once again on a mission with Brigham Young and George A. Smith. With sadness in his heart, he left behind 2 small children and a third just 2 weeks away from being born. But true to his convictions, Wilford faithfully accepted this assignment to strengthen the branches in the East and to gather funds for the building of the Nauvoo Temple.
While he was on this mission, the forces of destruction which had visited him frequently during his childhood returned for another attempt on the life of the future leader of the church. While he was traveling east, the express train he was riding in jumped from the tracks, resulting in a terrible wreck. The engineer was killed, but miraculously, Wilford and the other passengers were spared.
Before too long, Wilford was called home from his mission and returned to Nauvoo in early November. A few days later, he was able to partake of one of the most glorious ordinances of the Restoration. On November 11th, at Brother Joseph's residence, Wilford and Phoebe Woodruff were sealed for time and eternity by the patriarch Hiram Smith. Much of Wilford's time was now being spent in running the business affairs of the Times and Seasons newspaper. He was also called upon to raise funds for another printing of the Doctrine and Covenants. These duties, much to the joy of Wilford, kept him in close contact with the prophet Joseph.
Finally, in March of 1844, Wilford was able to move his family into the new home on which he had been laboring for some time. Since his call to the apostleship, Wilford had lodged his family in small temporary dwellings or in shared homes with others. Now, if the call came, Elder Woodruff would be able to leave his family in some degree of comfort. The call came soon, when the winds of mob violence and persecution began to blow even stronger during the spring of 1844. Joseph Smith called for all of the apostles except John Taylor and Willard Richards to travel east and campaign for his election to the presidency.
On the surface, it might seem odd that Joseph Smith, at a time of great tension in Nauvoo, all around them, the mobs were increasing in their calls for some kind of justice and some kind of activity that would bring the Mormons down. You'd expect that Joseph would keep those of his tight inner circle right there with him, that they would be there to protect him. These were people that he could trust. But instead, he sends them back east to begin the campaign for his presidency for the United States. Joseph was pleading his cause to the American people by running for president. He was trying to call attention to the way that the Mormons were being treated. But at the same time, I think he recognized that with the increase of problems there in Nauvoo, that those leaders of the church were at risk. Not only was Joseph at risk, but some of the others who were high profile, Wilford Woodruff being one of them. Joseph's credited with saying to Wilford at one point that he would be safer outside of Nauvoo. And so Wilford was gone at the time of the martyrdom. But when Wilford came back, he came back with that same desire and zeal and spirit of God as other members of the Quorum of the 12 to pick up and carry forward the work that Joseph had put in place.
In early May, Wilford went to the home of his beloved prophet and bid him farewell for the final time. He recorded,
He looked me steadily in the eye for a time without speaking a word. He looked as though he would penetrate my very soul. At the same time, he seemed unspeakably sorrowful, as if weighed down by a foreboding of something dreadful. He finally spoke in a mournful voice. God bless you, Brother Woodruff. Go in peace.
Elder Woodruff and the other apostles then left on their missions, never to see Joseph again. A little more than a month later, on the 27th of June, Wilford and Brigham Young found themselves in a railroad station in Boston. Wilford remembered.
It was 6:30 in Boston. At the station, Brigham was very sorrowful and depressed in spirit, not knowing the cause. This was the time when Satan struck the heaviest blow he had struck since the Son of God was crucified.
When Elder Woodruff returned to Nauvoo in August, he worked diligently with the rest of the 12 to combat the influence of Sidney Rigdon and others who were seeking to wrest away control of the church. However, at the same conference where Brigham Young was miraculously transformed into the visage of Joseph Smith, Wilford Woodruff was again called to return to England and preside over the missionary work in all of Europe. The gospel was not taken from the earth with the death of the prophet, and the leadership of the church was determined that the song of the Restoration should continue to be sung around the world.
Unable to take all three children with them to England, Wilford and Phoebe made the difficult decision to leave the older children with close friends and relatives. entrusting Wilford Jr. to the care of his good friend John Benbow, who had recently immigrated from England. Wilford and Phoebe departed for the East on the 24th of August. When they reached the East Coast, they left 2-year-old Phoebe Amelia with her grandparents and began the month-long journey across the choppy seas with their baby Susan Cornelia. Wilford stated,
"We were all very sick, yet we would spend a few moments in viewing the grand and sublime scenery that surrounded us in the wonders of the deep."
It was shortly after Elder Woodruff's arrival in England that he was introduced to a new variation of fishing.
Wilford Woodruff was an avid outdoorsman. He loved hunting and he loved fishing, but he was particularly in love with fishing. In fact, all the time that he was on his mission in England, he would compare missionary work with fishing, and he'd often have dreams about catching fish, and he would interpret that as going out and converting people to the gospel. And on his second mission to England, he was actually taught to fly fish by an old man who was 70 years old that took him fishing in the same river where Heber C. Kimball had first started to baptize people several years earlier in England. When Wilford Woodruff was 85 years old in 1892, he went on a camping trip up into the Uinta Mountains. And on that camping trip, he did a lot of fishing. And right after that, he wrote a letter to a magazine called Forest and Stream, telling them about the flora and the fauna, and particularly about the wildlife, and especially about the fish in Utah. And that letter was finally published in September of 1892.
While Wilford attended to the daily duties of overseeing the church in England, 2 events of significance took place. First was the birth of his 5th child on July 18th, a boy whom they named Joseph after their beloved prophet and whom they dedicated to the Lord. The second event was the obtaining of the copyright of the Doctrine and Covenants for publication in England. Wilford had received word that a group of apostates was on their way to London to secure the copyright and create confusion among the membership of the church. Thankfully, Elder Woodruff was able to reach London first and have 3,000 copies of the sacred revelations printed for the British saints.
Throughout the year of 1845, Wilford received numerous letters from Brigham Young explaining the unlikely prospects for peace in Nauvoo. Therefore, in January of 1846, knowing that the saints would soon be driven from their homes, Wilford put his wife and 2 children on a ship bound for New Orleans. 5 days later, Wilford boarded another ship and traveled to New York to pick up his daughter as well as his parents.
By the time Wilford reached Nauvoo on the 13th of April, 1846, the exodus from Nauvoo had already begun. However, within days of his arrival, Wilford was blessed to participate in the glorious event toward which the saints had labored for so long. On May 1st, Elder Woodruff offered the opening prayer in the dedicatory services of the Nauvoo Temple. Finally, the body of the saints were able to receive their promised endowments before setting out on the most difficult journey of their lives.
The personal preparation of Wilford as a future leader of the church was also continuing at this time. 2 days after his return home, with the consent of his faithful wife, Wilford entered into the sacred practice of plural marriage. On the 15th of April, 1846, during a tour of the temple, he was sealed to the 28-year-old English native, Mary Jackson.
Like most church leaders of his time, Wilford struggled with the concept of plural marriage. In the end, however, he obediently followed the directions from the Lord in the council of his leaders and accepted the call. He would go on to marry Emma Smoot Smith and Sarah Brown in 1853. And finally, in 1856, he was sealed to Sarah Delight Stocking. With his 5 wives, he would bring into the world a total of 33 children, many of whom were named with reverence after leaders in the church and his family.
Just 1 month after his return from England, Wilford departed the troubled city of Joseph with his family as well as his father and stepmother. He set up camp on the Iowa side of the river and recorded his feelings of undertaking such a difficult journey.
This was one of the worst days of my life. I had on the ground 3 baggage wagons, 1 family carriage, 6 yoke of oxen, 6 cows, 4 calves, 1 yearling, and a pair of mules. The whole care was upon myself. As soon as we started, the calves and cows all ran various ways. And while I was trying to get them together, the oxen broke the tongue out of my carriage. At last, we finally got camped at Blackjack Grove. I was very weary at night.
In addition to dealing with animals and broken equipment, Wilford also had to face the constant complainings of his stepmother. He stated,
Mother Woodruff handed me a lengthy epistle of complaint written in a book of 30 pages. To examine it was like a tempest in a teapot, or a bubble not worthy of notice. The more I have provided for her of late, the more she has complained.
It was not long thereafter that his stepmother abandoned the trek and returned to Nauvoo. And Wilford was not long settled into winter quarters when more tragedy struck his family. On the 12th of November, he reported,
We found our little boy Joseph was failing and could not possibly hold out longer. He had suffered much from convulsions during his sickness, but he breathed his last and fell asleep this morning, 15 minutes before 6 o'clock.
By the beginning of December, Wilford had completed a log cabin for his family. He had hoped that it might provide protection for the impending birth of his next child. Then, just days later, he recorded,
At 3:30 this morning, Mrs. Woodruff was delivered of a son which was ultimately 6 weeks before her time. We call his name Ezra. The boy is alive and smart and active, yet we cannot suppose him to live but a short time.
On December 10th, 1846, Wilford buried tiny Ezra Woodruff, the third of his children to pass beyond the veil.
Wilford's difficult family circumstances continued as he was forced to leave them behind in the spring of 1847 when he was assigned command of the 1st Company in Brigham Young's pioneer group. Phoebe was still grieving over the loss of her 2 children, and Mary had just given birth to her first and only child. However, Wilford did not flinch in his acceptance of a call to duty.
As the pioneers traveled across the country, the one thing that was a continual source of joy for Wilford was the many streams and rivers they were forced to cross. Wilford loved to stop and fish along the banks of the trout brooks. His adept fly fishing talents, which he acquired on his last mission to England, proved a great blessing to the whole company, as he often provided them with fresh fish for supper.
For 3 months, this small band of pioneers traveled westward. They calculated mileage, marked trails, and planted crops, all so the tens of thousands of saints who would follow after them would have a slightly easier time. As they neared their destination, Brigham Young became very ill and was forced to rest a great deal of the time.
Brigham Young became seriously ill on July 12, 1847, at a place called the Needles on the Utah-Wyoming border. And he could not move for 3 days. The main group went on ahead, but Wilford Woodruff came back to get Brigham Young because his carriage was one of the nicer carriages and would give him an easier ride. So Brigham Young was brought into the Salt Lake Valley by Wilford Woodruff, and Wilford Woodruff is the one who's lived to tell us what he said. And he definitely said words to the effect of, "This is the place."
It was from the back of Wilford's carriage that Brigham Young beheld for the first time the Salt Lake Valley. Wilford recorded,
This, the 24th day of July, 1847, was an important day in the history of my life and in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We came in full view of the valley of the great Salt Lake, the land of promise, held and reserved by the hand of God as a resting place for the saints.
Because most of the men who arrived with Brigham Young had left their families back on the prairie, they were anxious to lay down roots and make preparations to leave again. Wilford went straight to work. He stated,
I had in my carriage 1 bushel of potatoes, and I covenanted that I would not eat nor drink until the potatoes were planted in the earth. I fulfilled that covenant, getting some of the brethren to help me, and soon had my potatoes planted.
A month after his arrival, Wilford had his first crop in the ground and his 2-room home built. He was now ready to make the return journey to winter quarters with President Young. They departed the Salt Lake Valley on August 26th, following the trail they had made just a month earlier.
En route, they met up with several companies of saints heading toward the valley. Wilford's second wife, Mary Ann, and his father, Aphet, were traveling in one of these companies, and so they spent some time together before their companies parted to travel in opposite directions. One morning, Wilford and the company arose to find that Indians had stolen 50 of their horses in the night. Sending men after them, they were able to recover just 5. This loss of animals made their journey east that much more difficult.
In October, the weary brethren arrived at winter quarters, having traveled to the Salt Lake Valley and back in just 6 months. Gathering gratefully with their families, the brethren planned to winter there in Iowa before leading more saints west in the spring. On December 5th, after much discussion by the 12, the First Presidency was reorganized with Brigham Young as prophet, seer, and revelator.
In 1848, as the remaining body of the saints in winter quarters prepared for the trek west, Wilford was called to another mission in the east. Due to the length of the call, he was allowed to take Phoebe and the children with him. They left in June and followed the trail they had traveled so miserably 2 years earlier in the exodus from Nauvoo. Wilford stopped for a time in the deserted city they once called home. He toured the Nauvoo temple, which at this point was still in good condition. However, just days after leaving Nauvoo, Wilford and Phoebe suffered another terrible loss when their 9-month-old daughter, Sarah Carter, died as they traveled across Illinois. This was the 4th of 7 children that Wilford and Phoebe had laid in the grave. The Woodruffs then made their way to Boston, where Wilford purchased a home for his family in the suburb of Cambridgeport. From here, Wilford headquartered his missionary efforts.
On several occasions, Wilford took his family to Scarborough, Maine to visit with Phoebe's family. However, in March of 1849, as Wilford returned from one of his many trips, he found his father-in-law, Ezra Carter, waiting with his family in Cambridgeport. He had decided to be baptized. On March 22, 1849, the sacred ordinance was performed. A few weeks later, Elder Woodruff said farewell to a group of 71 saints who were bound for the Salt Lake Valley.
On October 2nd, Wilford received word from the First Presidency that the following spring he should gather as many members as possible and return with his family to the Salt Lake Valley. On this mission in the east, Elder Woodruff visited the saints from Pennsylvania in the south to New Brunswick in the north. He organized several new branches, including one in Newark and one in Cape Cod, and he baptized nearly 200 souls.
On March 9, 1850, Wilford and his family left Boston with a group of over 100 new members. They traveled to New York, where they were met by another 100 who were ready to travel to the Rocky Mountains. The group voyaged by steamer from Philadelphia to St. Louis, and then again from St. Louis to Council Bluffs, Iowa, where they began a wagon train west, arriving in the Salt Lake Valley in October of 1850.
Wilford quickly set about to establish a home and means of providing for his family. He moved the small log cabin he built in 1847 to a new spot of ground across from the temple lot. Having brought a great deal of supplies and food staples with him from the east, Wilford opened a store for a time and sold the goods until they were depleted.
Having settled himself and seen to the welfare of his family, Wilford resumed his duties as a member of the Quorum of the 12. By 1854, he had become heavily involved with George A. Smith, the church historian, in keeping the records of the kingdom. In 1856, he was officially called by the First Presidency as the Assistant Church Historian, and would remain so for nearly 30 years.
Wilford Woodruff kept a journal for 63 years, and he wrote everything in it. It's very detailed. He even counted all the bricks in his house in Nauvoo and put in his journal, "My new house has so many bricks." And so those kind of details are very important if you're trying to reconstruct church history. So when he became church historian, he was amply qualified to take that job.
Wilford Woodruff is an important historian in two ways. One, a recorder of history. He said that he felt inspired to keep a diary. And so we have in the church archives these wonderful diaries that begin in 1833 and literally through the rest of his life until just weeks before he died. He keeps a faithful diary. Sometimes he has scribes, but mostly it's in his own hand. And as a result, we have only in Wilford Woodruff's diary mention of certain historical points. And also, Wilford felt inspired to write down the sermons of the prophet Joseph Smith and of Brigham Young and other church leaders. And some of our only records of these talks are found in Wilford Woodruff's diary. And another way that he becomes important is that he actually becomes the assistant church historian, working with George A. Smith beginning in the 1850s in Salt Lake.
Another contribution of Wilford Woodruff is in pushing hard enough to get John Taylor to put on paper his eyewitness account of the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram Smith. In 1855 and 56, the brethren were approaching the end of Joseph Smith's history that they were compiling, and they absolutely needed John Taylor's account of that event. He had written him, he and George A. Smith had pushed John Taylor to get an account written. Taylor, being so busy with other things, simply said, "I'll get to it." And almost until Wilford Woodruff literally camped out on his doorstep, did John Taylor finally take the time to put on paper that account of the martyrdom.
During the mid-1850s and the following decade, Elder Woodruff continued his duties as an apostle, church historian, civic leader, and father. By the 1870s, Wilford was getting on in years, but continued to travel and teach throughout the mountain settlements. He often traveled with President Young to visit members in southern Utah. And he participated very closely with Brigham in the building of the St. George Temple, which would become his home away from home before long. After taking part in the dedication of the temple in 1877, Wilford was called by President Young to serve as the temple president.
From the mid-1870s until his death, Wilford spent more time in St. George than any place else, and in the temple in particular. Wilford loved the St. George Temple. He'd helped in its design and its dedication. He had a special white doeskin suit that he loved to wear in the temple as he served in the house of the Lord. During the anti-polygamy raids, he even had special quarters in the St. George Temple where he could go and retire and rest.
Elder Woodruff performed his first endowments for the dead in the St. George Temple. One of his earliest vicarious endowments was for Robert Mason, the visionary man who had encouraged the young Wilford to seek out the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. Wilford performed vicarious ceremonies for many great and noble men of the 17th and 18th centuries, including the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the deceased presidents of the United States, except for Van Buren and Buchanan, who had mistreated the saints.
I sometimes look at the St. George Temple And I've come to this realization that, we've often looked at how the signers of the Declaration of Independence appeared to Wilford Woodruff and said, you need to do our work here. And I thought, oh, well, okay, they need to do their work. But then you realize that they hadn't been doing work for the dead until they finished the St. George Temple, until they finished that lower level and dedicated it with Brigham Young. And so here's Wilford Woodruff doing this work. He's right there. He's even sleeping in the St. George Temple sometimes, and was so caught up in the work that was going on there that you recognize how the Lord's in charge of this work. He's in charge of everything that's happening. He's bringing this piece from here in the, those who worked for independence for America, and this piece from here, Wilford Woodruff, who was taught the gospel, who was taught the endowment by Joseph Smith, and it's coming together here in the St. George Temple.
Wilford was doing the work he loved in the St. George Temple at the time of Brigham Young's passing in August of 1877. Elder Woodruff quickly made the railroad journey to Salt Lake, arriving in time for the family viewing and the funeral in the tabernacle. Following the service, Elder Woodruff offered the prayer of dedication upon the grave of his beloved friend and fellow church leader, Brigham Young.
Shortly after John Taylor was unanimously sustained by the 12 as the new president of the Quorum, he assigned Wilford to head up a committee that would separate Brigham's finances from those of the church.
In 1879, a dark and difficult period in church history began when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the anti-bigamy law of 1862 was constitutional. Immediately, federal marshals in Utah began dutiful enforcement of the law restricting plural marriage, and their main target was the leadership of the church. Realizing his vulnerability to prosecution, Wilford went quickly into hiding, having to leave his cherished wives and children in separate homes around the Salt Lake Valley. Traveling first to southern Utah, Wilford then left from St. George with several other brethren and journeyed south into the desert wilderness of Arizona.
Elder Woodruff would spend over a year moving regularly between various communities in Arizona, Nevada, and southern Utah. He also made trips back to St. George often to visit the temple.
In October of 1880, Wilford journeyed in secrecy to Salt Lake to participate in General Conference. At the historic meeting, the First Presidency was again organized with George Q. Cannon and Joseph F. Smith being called as counselors to John Taylor. The brethren then sustained Wilford as the new president of the 12.
For a time, the federal marshals had relaxed their efforts to imprison the Mormon leaders. However, in 1882, the Edmunds Act was passed with even more stringent anti-polygamy laws. By 1884, Wilford and his fellow leaders were once again forced to go underground. Wilford once more traveled to northern Arizona and southern Nevada to avoid arrest. On March 1st, 1885, on his 78th birthday, he wrote from his lonely exile.
I am 78 years old this day. I find myself in Bunkerville, Lincoln County, Nevada. I have been driven from my wives and children thence for the gospel's sake.
Elder Woodruff remained ever faithful despite the loneliness and frustration that came with living in exile. He continued to visit the St. George Temple and secretly traveled to Salt Lake when necessary to perform his duties as president of the 12. One such trip in November of 1885 allowed him the unhappy opportunity to bid a final farewell to his beloved wife, Phoebe. She had been gravely ill, and just hours after being blessed and anointed for burial by her husband, she passed away peacefully on November 10th, 1855. Wilford was pained by his inability to attend her funeral. He recorded,
I am passing through a strange chapter in the history of my life. Persecution is raging against the Latter-day Saints. Still, I am perfectly willing for my wife to lie down and go to sleep and be freed from the persecution from the wicked. Phoebe is better off to be at rest. than to live longer in affliction.
I think it's important to understand how Wilford Woodruff dealt with his families after Phoebe's death. His legal wife was Emma Smith, and he continued to live with her and to provide some support for his other families, but he didn't live directly with them during that period. In a sense, he was a spiritual polygamist, but a temporal monogamist.
In the early summer months of 1887, the health of President John Taylor became an issue of great concern for the whole church. And on July 16th, Wilford, still exiled in the South, received a letter from George Q. Cannon stating that they expected President Taylor's death any day. Immediately, President Woodruff set out in his carriage for Salt Lake City, hoping to arrive in time to see his friend and leader. Unfortunately, by the time he reached Fayette 10 days later, he was greeted by the news that John Taylor had passed away.
On July 29th, due to continued persecution, Wilford stood behind the curtains of his office and watched as the funeral procession of his predecessor rolled by. He stated,
President Taylor's death lays the responsibility of the church upon my shoulders. May thy servant Wilford be prepared for whatever awaits him on earth, and have power to perform whatever is required at his hands by the God of heaven.
Serving as the president of the Quorum of the 12, Wilford led in the councils of the church for almost 2 years, until on April 7, 1889, he was sustained at the General Conference as the president of the church.
The time right before and right after Wilford Woodruff was called to be president of the church was some of the most difficult time in church history. Literally, the church itself is a corporate institution. Its leaders and many of its members were under the threat of immediate arrest and prosecution and persecution. The government had turned its face towards Utah and decided to fulfill its pledge to end plural marriage in the territories. And so this was a terrible time to become president of the church. Wilford Woodruff, well-educated, sensitive to the Spirit, a great leader, was almost beyond his physical capacity to do so. But it was also a time of revelation and inspiration. And during this period of deep persecution, he kept dealing with the issue, what do we do? We're supposed to support the government. We're supposed to sustain the laws. Yet the Lord has given us this commandment to live plural marriage. And the Supreme Court, in the meantime, had sustained the federal law against plural marriage. And so with these issues before him, finally Wilford Woodruff came to grips that he needed to go to the Lord. And in this critical time in 1889, he talked to the Lord, he prayed the Lord, and so that by 1890 he'd come to the resolution that the Lord wanted him to act. As a result of this inspiration, of this revelation, Wilford Woodruff presented to his counselors and to the 12 a document now called the Manifesto, published by the church as the official declaration number 1. And this document announced to the world that the LDS Church was determined to follow the laws, the constitutional laws of this country. And thus this document, eventually voted upon in church conference in October 1890, began the process of ending new plural marriages.
Inasmuch as laws have been enacted by Congress forbidding plural marriages, which laws have been pronounced constitutional by the court of last resort, I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws, and to use my influence with the members of the church over which I preside to have them do likewise.
This declaration ended a sacred practice which had been in place for over 50 years. It was a practice that defined the church for many non-believers around the country, both then and now. And it was the saints' dedication to this and other principles that forced them from their varied homes throughout the world to their place of refuge in the Rocky Mountains. And although the manifesto brought to a close a difficult chapter in the history of the church, it was not an action in which Wilford took much pleasure. He stated,
I want to say that the step which I have taken in issuing the manifesto has not been done without earnest prayer before the Lord. I am about to go into the spirit world. I expect to meet the face of my Heavenly Father. I expect to meet the face of Joseph Smith, of Brigham Young, of John Taylor. And for me to have taken a stand in anything which is not pleasing in the sight of God or before the heavens, I would rather have gone out and been shot.
With the objectionable practice of polygamy discontinued, many leaders from around the world succumbed to their curiosity and began to visit the Mormon city in the desert. President Woodruff entertained an attaché from Russia, the president of Harvard University, and the Reverend Dr. Shedahari from Bombay. He was even called upon to receive a group of 400 Presbyterian ministers, as well as the President of the United States, Benjamin Harrison.
with the lessening of government persecutions, the saints were able to focus their efforts on the completion of a task they had begun nearly 5 decades earlier. On April 6, 1893, President Wilford Woodruff offered the dedicatory prayer at the newly completed Salt Lake Temple.
April 6, 1893, 40 years since they commenced the building of the temple in April 6, 1853. That momentous day, the saints gathered, 2,500 of them in the upper room of the Salt Lake Temple. Wilford Woodruff read the prayer of dedication. It was a glorious time for Wilford Woodruff. It was a lifetime dream fulfilled. At the end of the year, in 1893, he wrote a synopsis in his diary, as was his custom, to talk about what had happened. And he mentions how the greatest changes concerning the church had occurred in 1893 than its entire history. I mean, literally, for the first time, the enemies of the church in Utah had dropped their arms and said, yes, we support the citizens of Utah to have a state. They'd gone back to the World's Fair in Chicago, and the Mormon Tabernacle Choir had taken second place. I mean, this was an incredible event that the church had done so well. The leaders of the nations and of the U.S. government welcomed Wilford Woodruff and George Buchanan and Joseph S. Smith while they were at the fair. They spoke in different meetings. And interestingly enough, he even notes in his diary how even the mayor and the leading citizens of Jackson County entertained them. But even with all these incredible, important changes that had occurred, Wilford Woodruff said, the greatest thing that has happened in this year was the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple. His words, great power was manifest on that occasion.
While the blessings of the temple had been previously available to the church in the St. George Temple, the completion of this house of the Lord in Salt Lake City signified the church's victory over intolerance and persecution. What they had been prevented from doing in Independence and in Far West, they were able to do in the Rocky Mountains. And this sacred new edifice would quickly become the new symbol of Mormonism for the 20th century.
One other thing that bears remembering is Wilford Woodruff's decision to cease the practice of non-bloodline sealings. It was common practice until then to seal people who hadn't been related through bloodlines to each other. Wilford Woodruff, as they begin to more formally organize the Genealogical Society of Utah, made the decision that those sealing practices should only be performed for direct bloodline ancestors.
In December of 1893, the House of Representatives passed a bill admitting the state of Utah into the Union. Wilford stated,
Glory to God in the highest, for he fulfills his word to the sons of men.
President Woodruff's energies during the last few years of his life were spent chiefly on 3 different battles. The first was the political conflict created by a state dominated by Mormon voters. There were many heated debates concerning the election of officials and to which political party a faithful saint should belong. And when one of the Quorum of the 12 claimed that Satan was the author of the Republican Party, Wilford was forced to step in. He recorded,
The day has come when God Almighty requires at your hands to unite together in your temporal business and in your politics so far as it is wisdom. I do not care whether a man is a Republican or a Democrat. In that he is free. But it is your duty to unite in electing good men to govern. And I will state then, when you do not this, you are losers of the blessings of Almighty God.
The second great battle for the new president was the ongoing problem of church indebtedness. With the confiscation of church property and the costly legal battles, the church was in dire straits financially. This difficulty was somewhat alleviated at the end of 1893, when Congress returned much of the church's property, along with over $400,000 in cash.
The third and final battle, one which Wilford would ultimately lose, was the struggle against his failing health. He took several convalescing trips to California and even a trip to Alaska in an effort to gain control of his asthma, rheumatism, and bilious colic. At the April conference of 1898, perhaps sensing that the end was near, President Woodruff addressed the saints concerning the progress of the kingdom. He related to them the testimony of Joseph Smith, born 60 years earlier on the trail of Zion's camp.
It is only a handful of priesthood you see here, but this church will fill North and South America. It will fill the Rocky Mountains. There will be tens of thousands of Latter-day Saints who will be gathered to the Rocky Mountains. They will build temples to the Most High.
Wilford then added his own witness.
I name these things because I want to bear testimony before God, angels, and men, that mine eyes behold the day, and have beheld for the last 50 years of my life the fulfillment of that prophecy.
In August of 1898, Wilford was feeling particularly unwell and decided to take a trip to California with his wife Emma and his counselor George Q. Cannon. He stayed at the home of Colonel Isaac Trumbo in San Francisco, and for a time he seemed to recover. He went to the coast and saw the seals. He rested and wrote letters. Then, on the 1st of September, President Cannon wrote a hasty telegram to his fellow counselor, Joseph F. Smith.
President Woodruff's condition very serious. It is the opinion of experts this may terminate his mission. He is not sensible at this time. The attack was very sudden. Suppressed urine the cause, his advanced age against him.
The following day, another telegram.
He slept peacefully all night and passed away without movement. Break the news to his family.
Wilford Woodruff had survived his first brush with death at the age of 3, and countless were the times thereafter that the Lord had intervened to preserve the life of this chosen leader until the age of 91. From the moment he had accepted the news of the restoration, Wilford never turned his back on a call from the Lord or questioned an assignment from his superiors. He sacrificed the company of his family and the comforts of his home to take the gospel to distant lands and to defend the principles in which he believed. The guidepost which directed the life of Wilford Woodruff is best described in the words of Dr. J.M. Tanner.
To no man's mind was God ever a more potent reality in the affairs of men than to his mind. To him, he was not a distant being whose mysteries obscure and overawe. To Wilford Woodruff, God was a companion, a kind and loving father, a protector, a guide. That God spoke with men face to face was no metaphor to him. It was a commonplace, though profound truth. He regarded himself as a child of God to whom and with whom he had a right to speak. There was nothing in life which a man might not disclose to his Maker, and he aspired to commune with God as one man speaketh to another.
From the first anniversary of his baptism, when Wilford Woodruff consecrated all he had to the Lord, he never faltered. Giving heart and soul to the latter-day work, he vivaciously spread the gospel, tenderly raised his family, and faithfully led his people. Clearly, Wilford Woodruff gave his life to the Lord.